We're just ready to start now. I think our speaker today needs little introduction, but I'm just going to do a short one anyway. Lord Alf Dubs is best known for his passionate condemnation of UK asylum policy and advocacy for refugees, and he was the author of the 2016 amendment of the Immigration Act, the Dubs Amendment, which is about taking child refugees to Britain. Alf is going to start with a speech on his life, having come to the UK via the Kindertransport, fleeing the Nazis from his birthplace in Prague. So can we have a round of applause for Lord Alf Dubs?
Thank you. Right. Thank you for that. You want me to start?
With a speech, yes.
Right, okay. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Understand I'm going to say a bit and then you're going to ask me a few questions. That's the system, isn't it?
That's the plan.
Okay. Well, very, very briefly, as you said, I came at the age of 6 to this country on a Kindertransport from Czechoslovakia in July 1939. The person who organized the Kindertransport, a name you may have heard, was a guy called Nicky Winton. Fantastic man who just arrived in Prague, saw what was happening and said he's got to do something. And mostly people see awful things and then say, well, okay, it's terrible, and walk away. But he stayed there and did it, and he battled with the Home Office to get permission for children to come. He battled with the Nazis who were suspicious of him. So to cut a long story short, my father was Jewish, my mother wasn't. He said to his cousins, if the Nazis come here, I'm leaving. And they said they'll take their chance, and in 1942 the Gestapo took them to Auschwitz. So my father got to London, so I was luckier than most. My mother was refused permission to leave and put me on a Kindertransport, and I was 6 years old. Before that, we'd had to, I always remember this quite vividly, we'd had to tear a picture of President Benesch out of our school books and stick in a picture of Hitler. And for a 6-year-old, that was quite traumatic. I want a school book, and I noted that. And there were German soldiers everywhere. And then my mother got me on a Kindertransport. I was one of the young, if not the youngest. And I can still see the scene at Prague Station, anxious parents, German soldiers with swastikas, and a lot of anxiety. I didn't understand fully what was happening. When we got to the Dutch border, the seats were hard wooden, but of course as a 6-year-old you don't mind hard wooden seats. Got to the Dutch border and the older ones cheered because we were out of reach of the Nazis. Well, I knew it was significant, but not why. I was looking for windmills and wooden shoes, which is what I knew of Holland, but they couldn't see any. Anyway, we got to Hook of Holland, Harwich, and then to Liverpool Street. And my father met me, so I was lucky. Probably over half didn't have a family member meeting them, not immediately, and some never saw their parents again. My father got me to school. I spoke Czech and German, but no English, so I had to learn English. Well, I have to say, a school playground is a tough place, and you learn the language pretty fast. But if I make a lousy speech, which I'm sure is often, and when people tell me that, I say, well, it is my third language. How good is your third language? And that sort of keeps them away. Anyway, I was passionately interested in politics from age about 13 or 14, when most people aren't. Eventually, I said, I'd really like to, as a refugee, what can I do? I can't really get in for Parliament. Maybe I can become a local councillor, which I did. But a friend of mine said, look, just have a go. Have a go. So in the 1970 election, I was the Labour candidate for the cities of London and Westminster, which is, after all, the central constituency in London. And my Tory opponent, who won, was Christopher Tugendhat. So we had the spectacle of a refugee from Vienna competing with a refugee from Prague for the constituency in the middle of the country. And the media never picked it up. It's quite a good story for them, but they never picked it up. And I did nothing about it. I never talked about my background, except that there was a moment in the Commons when I eventually got elected for Battersea. I was put on the committee dealing with the British Nationality Bill, which became Present Nationality Act. And I thought to myself, here am I on a committee of a small number of people. I'm a naturalized Brit, which I was then, to be put on committee dealing with British citizenship. And I thought, what other country would have given that opportunity to a refugee? So I sometimes I couldn't believe I was in the House of Commons. I kept sort of scratching my head and saying, here's Margaret Thatcher. I'm trying to shout at her, and I'm a refugee. Anyway, so I got used to it in the end, but I was finding it disconcerting. I didn't have any background. I only had my mum, who eventually got out, and no politics talked at home. I didn't have any of this. So I'm not like David and Ed Miliband, who, brought up in politics from their mother's milk. Anyway, so I became the MP. I was on this committee, and then I lost my seat, and eventually I was put in the House of Lords as political. It's sort of a compensation for political defeat. You get put in the House of Lords. I think we should be elected, but that's for another discussion. Anyway, I fast forward. Well, unelected people. What's the good of that? Huh? I mean, come on, it's supposed to be a democracy. Now, they give you also, it's funny, most of my friends in the Lords don't agree with me. I'm a bit of a lone voice, not quite a lone voice. Anyway, to be more serious. So, in 2016, along came the immigration bill. And at the same time, Save the Children had identified 95,000 child refugees somewhere in Europe. You'll tell me when my time's up, because I can go on a bit. So I put down an amendment saying we should take some of them, take 3,000. The amendments there, government ministers got a bit excited, and Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, invited me to go and see her. Now, I'd met her once before, because Nicky Winton, he died 2 years ago, aged 106, but at his birthday parties, he lived in Maidenhead, so he was a constituent of Theresa May. So she came along one day, and I did meet her. Anyway, she summoned me in to see her and said, I'd like you to withdraw the amendment. And I said, why? And she said, because if these children come, others will follow. So I said, just a minute. First of all, there's no hard evidence of that. And secondly, are you saying we should just ignore children sleeping in the jungle, in terrible conditions on the Greek islands, or what have you? Are we going to just ignore them? These are young people vulnerable to criminality, prostitution, trafficking, and so on. We can't just turn our back on them. Well, we parted company. So the amendment passed in the Lords. I was told by my friends in the Commons to sit in the gallery for the Lords where you can look at the... So I was looking at the Conservative benches. We kept this non-party political, but nevertheless, we had to win Conservative MPs over. The others were on side. I think they were. So I sat there, and they said, sit up in the gallery and give them the eye. I was all alone up there because it wasn't like Prime Minister's questions. So I don't know how you give them the eye, so I glared at them. And one or two looked a bit uncomfortable because I could see they weren't going to vote the way we'd thought they would, and it was slightly defeated. Anyway, and then, are you up for some parliamentary gobbledygook? You're probably sophisticated enough to know all this. So what happened was that the amendment, which said 3,000 children we should take, because it involved expenditure, as most Lords' amendments do, the clerks in the Commons said this is a matter of financial privilege. Now, normally the government waived that, but they didn't. And the Speaker told them off for that. He said they should have better arguments against the amendment than that. Anyway, we had to drop the 3,000 figure. Okay? It went back to the Lords, we got a bigger majority, and then something amazing happened. Public opinion suddenly woke up to all this. And public opinion manifested itself in terms of, I got far more supportive emails and letters than hostile ones. It manifested itself in local groups setting up to welcome refugees. And it manifested itself in a lot of pressure on a number of Conservative MPs. So Theresa May summoned me in again, and she said, look, we're going to accept your amendment. Now, I knew it wasn't generosity of soul, it was because they were going to lose it second time round. So, and the government minister said, we propose to accept the letter and spirit of your amendment. Well, it's my contention they've done no such thing. They arbitrarily capped the figure. Originally, they knew it was going to be 3,000 before the financial privilege argument. They capped the figure at 350, which they then increased to 480, saying that there were not enough local authorities who were able to provide foster places for the children. And we said, but we know local authorities are willing. And that's where the argument still goes on. There's a second scheme called the Dublin Treaty, which is an EU treaty, which the bit of it we're talking about says a refugee child in one EU country can join family or relatives in another. So say a Syrian boy in France could join an uncle in Sweden. And we got about 800 over here under that scheme, After all, in the jungle in Calais, they were all mixed up anyway. The ones under my amendment and the others. So we've got 800, and so far about 250 have come under my amendment. Given there are several thousand in Greece and elsewhere, in the meantime, have any of you been to the jungle? Did any of you get to the jungle? Probably not, because it's been cleared. So the first time I got to the jungle, there was a little shopping street there. Conditions were awful. A shopping street in the middle of the jungle. And on display were tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. And I said, what are they doing here? And they said, well, the then French government cleared part of the camp even before I got there. And they were very worried about the National Front, who were quite strong in that part of France, in the Calais area. So they used tear gas and rubber bullets on the refugees to drive them off part of the camp. And I said, but how can one do that? They're refugees. And I said, if you behave like the National Front, you're hardly winning the argument against the National Front. So I thought that was pretty shocking. Anyway, the French then came to clear the camp, and we urged to get more refugees over. We got some over, but not that many, and they were dispersed over France, and some made their way back, and they're still sleeping under the trees in Calais. I also found that the ones particularly the young people in the jungle, they set their sights on getting to Britain one way or another, and they used to wait for a lorry to break down on the motorway near there, and they would get on the back of it. Dangerous. And we tried to say, look, we're developing legal paths to safety. Because I'd said to Theresa May, these young people are vulnerable to criminality, trafficking, prostitution, a terrible situation for them. And then they're liable to get killed coming over illegally on the trucks. Anyway, so there was a little bit of hope, because that's what they were setting out to do. Well, then I went to the camps in Greece, and the conditions there are pretty bad, and the Greek government are finding it hard to cope. And the most recent thing I went to was Lesbos, where there's a big camp designed for 2,000, which has about 9,000 people in, not just Syrians, but from African countries and Afghans as well. And there's an overflow camp of 2,000 they're sleeping under tarpaulins. And that was pretty desperate. And Médecins Sans Frontières said, be careful when you go there. It isn't as it seems. At night, there's no security, and even young boys get sexually assaulted and raped in that camp. It is terrible there. And there's no hope there. At least in Calais, there's a feeling they might get over to Britain. There's no hope there at all, and they can't get off the island. Desperate situation. I've also been to Jordan. Now, Jordan's better organized, although there are about 1 million refugees in Jordan, about 1 million in Lebanon, about 3 or 4 million in Turkey. So when people say, why don't the Muslim countries do something, I say, come on. Just think of the numbers that there are in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And we're talking millions there. Anyway, the camp in Jordan is one called Zaatari. Most refugees in Jordan are not in a camp, but Zaatari has 80,000 people in it. They're now in sort of prefab buildings, and they've got heating and water, sanitation. Physically, it's better, and they've got education. But I was talking to a young man about 17 who finished the school in the camp. He can't get a job in the camp. He can't get a job outside the camp. What are you going to do? No future. And one of the key things about refugees is the lack of hope. He had no hope. In the Greek islands, they have no hope. Some of them in Calais had a bit of hope, but and the Rohingyas in Burma can't have any hope. And it is this lack of hope. I feel that people can put up with very difficult physical conditions if there's some hope for them. But where there's no hope, it's a big ask to say, just keep going, when there's nothing we can offer you, which is why I'm so keen on pushing our government to do more for refugees. The context is there are 30 million refugees in the world. There are 35 million displaced persons who fled to another part of their own country for safety. And we are arguing about a tiny handful. And when a couple of hundred Iranians crossed the channel and the Home Secretary virtually called a state of emergency, you think, and there are more arriving on the Greek islands every day than that, you think we're getting it all out of proportion. So I think there's such a thing as humanity, and there's such a thing as behaving decently. There's one other thing I want to say. It's this, and this has been very humbling for me. I've met young people from this country, but from others, who are working as volunteers in the jungle, what was left of the jungle, who are working in the camps in Greece, and who are giving years of their lives for virtually no money to help very vulnerable refugees, particularly child refugees. And I just think these people get no medals, they get no accolades, they get no praise, and yet they're doing something absolutely terrific, and a lot of them. And it's a great tribute to young people, mainly from Britain, but Irish, other countries, Americans, who are doing this. And I think they deserve a lot of thanks from all of us for showing such humanity. And then let me come on to finishing. One of the threats is the far right. And we've seen how the far right have exploited the migration and refugee issue in many countries. We've seen it in Italy, in Germany, in Austria, we've seen it in France. And that boat crossed the Mediterranean. The Italians wouldn't let it land, and it went to Spain. And bless them, the Irish government said to the Spanish, we'll take some of them. But there's not much European cooperation on this. And I just would like to see, if we weren't getting into Brexit, we might have more influence, that there should be a Europe-wide refugee policy. Now, the Hungarians, I was saying to some people earlier, the Hungarian policy is refugees are not our concern, we're only interested in white Christians. Now, whatever is that? And the Czechs, Slovaks, and the Poles are similar. That's pretty shabby too. So one of the things we have to do is to keep public opinion on side, and I do believe that most British people, when it's put to them, will say, child refugees, yeah, we're prepared to accept that. We're prepared to accept more of them. So that is where the argument is now, and that is where it stands. And I just think the way we in Britain and the way we in Western Europe deal with refugees is going to be a real test of the sort of society and sort of country we are. Everybody stands here and says this is the biggest challenge. Okay, climate challenge is a mega challenge, but refugees in the world are also a big challenge. We hear more about the ones in northern France. We don't hear much about the Rohingyas because they're too far away for the television cameras, and it's pretty depressing. But I think we have some enormous challenges ahead of us, and I like to feel that we can keep pressing the government. And if any of you feel like lobbying your MPs or your local councils, please go and ask your MPs what they're doing about child refugees, and ask your local councils whether they're able to take some more refugees or take some. If they're doing a good job, pat them on the back. If they're not, ask them why not. And finally, let me say this. There was two things. There was a Syrian boy standing next to me opposite Parliament. He was learning English. He'd been here about 2 years. He was now 16. And I said, look, what do you want to do in life? Pointed to the Palace of Westminster and said, you know what? He said, I want to become an MP. And I said, that's great. There's some marvelous people who are MPs, but you ought to try and meet a few MPs first before you finalize on that option in your life. So he said, yes. Let me say as a final thing. Look, I think this country has given me tremendous opportunities. It's given me a warm welcome. I've been very lucky indeed. And I just like to feel that other refugees coming to Britain are given the same warm welcome and opportunities that I had. Right, forgot about that.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. That was really interesting. And I was wondering, we feel like we've made a lot of progress, and we have as a society from when you came over here in terms of like becoming more tolerant, more open. Why do you think now, though, that we are almost accepting either the same number or less refugees than we did then? Why were you able to come here 50 years ago, but so many people aren't able to come here now? What do you think's changed in our culture?
80 years ago.
80 years ago.
Okay.
Flattering you.
Well, first of all, there were some, if you look at the Hansards for the House of Commons debates in 1938, there were some arguments put then, which are the arguments put now. We don't have any room for these people and so on. But the prevailing view was Parliament decided yes. I think it was over the wishes of Chamberlain. I think it's one of those occasions when the Prime Minister was out of line with his cabinet. Is that new? Yes, it is a bit. Anyway, I think what's happened, first of all, when the G8 countries joined the EU, Britain, Sweden and Ireland said they can all come immediately, those who want to exercise freedom of movement. All the other countries said there's going to be a 5 or 7 year period. And the Polish embassy said to us, there'll be 30 million Poles, 30,000 Poles will come to Britain. In fact, 1 million came. Now, there's nothing wrong in principle with that, but I think we should have kept pace with the other countries because it sort of distorted things and the public were taken aback. However, I believe in the freedom of movement. I was in favour of it at the time, and I think it's a good thing, but maybe it should have been handled slightly differently. But then what happened is that the Conservative government said, we're going to set limits on refugees, we're going to cut the numbers. And that made it even more political than before if a government says, we want to cut the numbers. Because it immediately says people who are here shouldn't be here. and there can be hostility to them. And then came Brexit. Now, look, I probably knocked on as many doors canvassing for Remain as anybody you've met. I claim that. I did night after night anyway, so I think I must have done. And I was mainly in Hammersmith, which was 70-30 for Remain. And even there, I was on the White City estate, which has very few white people on it, but that's just the way the history works. Even there, immigration was the one argument that was being used. And take back control was interpreted as meaning, yeah, that means immigration. Didn't mean anything else. Whatever they say now, it didn't mean it. And I'll give you a story. One woman said to me, immigration. So I said, but look, I was in a hospital. I had a small medical procedure for one day. Everybody who treated me, doctors, nurses, they're all immigrants. Where would I be without them? And she said, it's not the ones that are here now that bother me. It's the ones that are going to come. And you'll remember during the Brexit campaign, the referendum, Farage put up these posters showing lots of people coming in. And then Boris Johnson said, and he's denying it now, but he said it, he said, if we stay in the EU, 70 million Turks are poised to enter Britain, effectively tomorrow. This was a downright lie. And that was what alarmed people. And that's where it all got worse. And I'd hoped that the campaign on behalf of child refugees would actually soften attitudes to refugees and migrants generally. And I fear that Brexit reversed that process. I still believe, however, that most British people accept that if you tell them what the situation is for young people and what they've suffered and what they're escaping from, they'll say, okay, we can take some more. I believe that. No, I get a few hostile letters. By the way, as a comment on this, if you're a man in public life, the hostility you get is so much less than if you're a woman. Whether it's Diane Abbott or Luciana Berger, they get the most terrible abusive stuff. And I know Twitter, if it's really nasty, Twitter doesn't let it come through. But even so, and something about British life where the misogyny is rampant and women get it much. But I've been blamed. I've had letters saying, you want these children to come here, they'll all become terrorists like you, me. And I had another one saying the Parsons Green bombing was all my fault because it was a refugee, not one that came under my amendment, but a refugee, and I should pay compensation and so on. So there are those, but I get very little of that compared to what some of the women in politics get.
So on that topic of hostility, I was looking at the stats for where in the countries refugees are resettled, and it's very disproportionate refugees are settled in the north and in Scotland and not much in the south. But obviously a lot of the south voted for Brexit. Now, what do you think is influencing people's attitudes in terms of like why people in different leave areas voted leave with attitudes towards immigration?
Well, I wish somebody would have the answer. Look, no, I think there was another element. I did say it was immigration, but there was another element, and I think we've seen it in other countries, and that is the feeling that the political elite, used fairly widely, is against us, that they don't care about us. And I think the feeling of being neglected is what helped Trump in the Rust Belt and elsewhere. It was I believe Hillary Clinton was seen as part of the American establishment, and Trump wasn't, and he managed to pick up votes for the people who felt nobody was speaking for them. And I think, in a way, some of the people in those areas felt that British government successively had just ignored them, had ignored their condition, and how could they express that? They could express it by voting against whatever they thought the government was in favour of. And I think that was also an element, as well as the immigration. I think it was an element. But again, a lot of it was expressed in terms of anti-immigration feeling. And in some of the areas where there are no non-white faces at all, no black faces at all, they're the most strident both for leave and most strident against immigrants. So it's a bit odd. And London, which is much more relaxed, I said London was 70-30 for Remain. And I think London has a much more relaxed attitude anyway to being a multicultural city. Mm-hmm. But maybe there are people who know more about it who can dissect this. But I just think that the further you get away from the southeast, the less tolerant you become about refugees. On the other hand, I've had a Labour MP from the northeast who say to me, the trouble with you people in the metropolitan elite are trying to tell us what to do. And I said, I don't think the people on the White City estate in Hammersmith were part of the metropolitan elite, but there you are.
So You talk about it as like an issue that's affecting all MPs, Labour and Conservatives. What do you think of Labour's tone on immigration right now? But we've heard stuff about migrants pushing down wages, and a lot of kind of passive voice statements about how freedom of movement will end once we leave the EU, but not much in terms of what Labour actually wants. Like, what do you think of the stance?
Well, I would like to see, look, I have to say, Jeremy Corbyn supports, he says he's very keen on this child refugee stuff. I mean, I've had a letter from his people saying if he can help in any way, he will. So he is, but I'd just like to feel that the party as a whole will take this on board and do it properly. I'd like to see the party take on board what some of us NGOs are talking about, which is we took 10,000 children under Kindertransport in 1 year, and we're saying, now, could we commit as a country to taking 10,000 children over the next 10 years, 1,000 a year, from Greece, France, and from Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Can we have that commitment? And I'm hoping we can push the Labour Party into doing it. So, look, I tell you what it is, and you'll know this as well as I do. Brexit has sucked the life out of everything. There's nothing left except Brexit. You spend your time talking about Brexit and arguing and listening to it and so on. And there's no time for thinking about other things. And I believe if we hadn't had all this Brexit stuff, then there'd be far more pressure on the government to do more for refugees. But I think there's a Tory MP from not far from here, Heidi Allen, and she's good on refugees. I judge them on two things, that they will remain people and they're good on refugees. Now, there are other issues in politics, but I'm simple soul about this. And she said, we've got to get refugees back in the headlines. Brexit can't dominate everything in politics, and she's right. So the answer is, I think it's distracted attention. I would like to feel the Labour Party will do what I would like them to do. I'm hopeful, but let me be guarded about that. Let's see.
Very fair, very fair. And back to your talk about Europe's like kind of pan-refugee policy. What do you think are the many flaws that you've outlined, and what do you think are the possible solutions to this, and how we in Britain, who may or may not be leaving the EU, can impact that?
Well, the trouble is, refugees and migrants have become such a political football now, and somehow we've got to stop that. If you let it be put about that we don't want these people, then individual people say, you shouldn't be here. Look, after the Brexit referendums, friends of mine in Kent, they said that they knew a Belgian couple who'd been 20 years living in Kent, and the day after the referendum, somebody said to them, and when are you getting out of here? We don't want you anymore. And the danger is that if one talks like that, it encourages hostility, and that is so damaging to people here. It's damaging to anybody here. It makes people feel unwelcome. Not surprising, some of the people from EU countries are now saying we don't want to be here. We feel unwelcome. I think it's a terrible, terrible comment on the sort of country we are that this should be the case, and we've got to argue against that. I mean, in Hammersmith, within a week of the referendum, we had a love not hate demo. There's a big Polish centre there on which they'd written awful graffiti of abuse. So we had this demo, and we're doing it every other year, just to sort of say, we want to be a different sort of country. But I think we've got to tackle that, and it's poisonous.
So this is something that local communities and central government need to tackle?
Yeah, it must be done at local level as well as central government, yes. And we've just got to be supportive of refugees. I think we've got to let it be known why we're supportive of refugees. And we've got to ensure that the culture is there. In some places, it's pretty good. In other places, they don't want refugees. And they will argue it's money and so on. Of course, money is an element, but those local authorities that are really committed, they do something and they find some of the money. But there are other things. For example, one issue that I've sort of learned a lot about, or learned something about, is mental health. Because some of these, in the jungle in Calais, there was a woman called Liz Clegg. She was older than most volunteers. She was a firefighter from Birmingham. She volunteered, and she was running a mother and child centre in the jungle. In a double-decker bus, which a British actor had driven over there, and using it as a thing. And she said, these young people here in the jungle in Calais may seem altogether, they may seem quite coherent and so on and so forth, but they're very shocked, some of them are very shocked and traumatized by what happened to them in their own country and the journey, and they'll need a lot of help and support. So I've got a doctor who's a student of psychiatry, who I've got her interviewing local authorities to see what the nature of mental health support is for refugees. And of course, it's very patchy. I've only started doing it. It's very patchy. But I can tell you a nice story though. When I was in Greece on one occasion, there was some of the workers, the volunteers or workers, said there was a Syrian boy who had serious mental health problems, and the Greeks locked him up in a police cell. Didn't know what to do with him. Anyway, when she got Hammersmith Council, I live in Hammersmith in London, and the leader of the council is a friend of mine, so maybe these things help. But anyway, they took him. Now this boy, he's getting 24/7 support. It costs 100,000 a year, but he's getting 24/7 support. And I'm just telling you a little anecdote here. So we arranged to meet him, the leader of the council and I, and some of his support workers, and he wanted to meet in Starbucks on Shepherd's Bush. Why Starbucks? Because they have ice cream frappe there, and the boy had learned to like ice cream things in Greece. And he came along. Now, he was a bit disturbed, but he was okay. And he was very amiable and friendly and wanted to hug people and so on. If we hadn't taken him, he'd have been locked up forever. And, you know, there are desperate situations for people. And surely we as a country can do better than we're doing. And that is a sort of the cry of the heart. And you know, we can do more. And we should. And if we don't... Now, as far as Europe is concerned, if we had a bit more... This is the other bit of your question. If we had a bit more influence in Europe, I would be arguing passionately that Europe should have a Europe-wide refugee policy. That we should have the same standards, we should treat people equally and decently and so on, so that they didn't feel totally denied in some countries and a bit more welcome in others. And we're sort of halfway in this. But, you know, our influence is now that much less. I don't think we can sort of mount a campaign because we're not even part of Schengen, so we can't do all this. But I just think we've still got to argue in favour of moving towards a Europe-wide refugee policy. We can't take them all. We can certainly do better than we're doing.
In terms of a Europe-wide refugee policy, we've heard about resistance from countries like Poland and Hungary. What kind of resistance do you think is coming from like Western Europe? Because obviously they have a lot more like political power and could presumably be doing more. What do you think stopping them?
Oh, the far right. I think the Germans, Angela Merkel, after all, has lost her position because of the far, what's that, ADF, or AF, Alliance for Deutschland, AfD. I think the far right has actually changed the balance of politics, and certainly, possibly in Germany, it has in Austria, it has in Italy, and in France, the National Front is still, you know, they did well. I mean, Macron won, but I mean, the National Front are quite strong. So I think the far right are one of the threats, and I think European governments are running scared. And that's why I say we've got to keep public opinion on our side in this country. But by the way, can I add one other thing? You know, we may say, well, the fascists, you know, National Front, BNP, and all these, Tommy Robinson, these people, that they haven't got anywhere. Well, first of all, we should never be complacent because they might. But secondly, let us be grateful that the fascist right in Britain has never, since Oswald Mosley, has never had good leadership. It's not our doing, it's just that they're hopeless in terms of leadership. But if they had good leadership, they could be more of a threat. So it's no good us saying, well, they're not going to get very far, they don't win elections and so on. I think that's complacency. I think there's a threat from the far right in all countries, and we shouldn't sit back and say, well, it's not going to happen here. It could happen here, which is why we must keep public opinion on side, because the best defense we have against the far right, apart from condemning them and all that, is to have the public on our side.
So talking to a bunch of university students, like, what kind of things can we as a community do, either to help refugees or to, you know, keep the public on side against the far right? What do you think initiatives people should be taking in their local communities?
Well, I think Cambridge Council is not too bad. Well, first of all, I think let your voice be heard. After all, you've got a very strong political voice, for heaven's sake, more than most people have. And you're not all from the metropolitan elite anyway, so they can't in the north of England blame you for being that. So I don't think you're all from the metropolitan elite. So I spent my childhood in Manchester and Blackburn, I can say that. Anyway, as well as being a refugee. Look, my ask is this. First of all, let your voice be heard. Let your voice be heard. You know, I think it's important that people who are not converted to the cause also hear the arguments and are exposed to them. Secondly, I think it's important to lobby local councils. If they're doing a good job, pat them on the back, and if they're not doing a good job, ask them why not. I think it's important to talk to your MPs. I think your guy in Cambridge is fine, and the Lib Dem predecessor was also fine on this issue, but they're not everywhere. And I think it's important to let your voice be heard, and let it be heard wherever you are and wherever you have influence, in any other organisation and so on where you have a voice. You know, it's a long haul. How does one influence people in a country? I think one just has to do it. And I think, as I say, I do think I'm right when I claim that child refugees are still mostly acceptable. And I believe that is the way in for refugees as a whole. by saying child refugees, we have a moral responsibility. And as a country, we have a tradition. We've taken refugees. You know, we've got a good history of this. When the Bosnians, we did Britain did a deal. We took several thousand from the Serb camps in Bosnia. They came to Britain, and they came, and there wasn't all the outcry. And when Idi Amin in Uganda and the Ugandans, they came, and that didn't work at all badly. It's got more difficult since. I know the numbers have gone up a bit, but it's more difficult since. But I think we just have to keep the public opinion on side and say to people what it is about refugees, why it is that under the 51 Geneva Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, why we have a responsibility. Because if we explain what happened to people, the journeys they had, the danger they had in their own country, the threats of torture, of imprisonment and death, these are terrible things to happen to people. And that's why we offer them safety, or we should do.
So we've seen the far right rising in a lot of countries at the same time around Europe, and a lot of people have put this down to improved communication like the internet. What do you think modern technology is doing to enable the rise of the far right, and how do you think it's different to obviously the last time we had a significant far right movement across Europe?
Well, I think word gets about much quicker, and it can be targeted, and it can be used that way. I think you're probably a better judge. I mean, there are people in the Lords who don't even use emails. You know, I don't get that. But mind you, I've got 14,000 emails in my inbox. I bet none of you have that many. My delete button's worn out, but it's the menace of this as well. Look, I'm not an expert on it. I think what the electronic things have done, I think they've opened up the doors to a torrent of abuse, nastiness. And as I was saying earlier, how some people in public life, particularly women, are the victims of this. And somehow that's got to be controlled because it is extremely nasty. And of course, short of being unacceptably nasty, I mean, look, Margaret Hodge, she was describing if you could take the language, people said to her, "You're a fucking cunt." You know, this is shocking. You know, and other people. I mean, who's the woman on Countdown? You don't watch Countdown. The young woman actor. She's got brilliant maths. Huh? Yeah, Rachel Riley. She's had a lot. She's spoken up. She's Jewish. She's spoken up. She gets terrible abuse. You know, and so on the positive side, the electronic stuff spreads the word. On the negative side, it allows for nastiness and abuse to creep in. And governments are finding it quite hard to know how to come to terms with it. You can't stifle freedom of expression. You can't stifle freedom of speech. But on the other hand, when it gets very nasty, what do you do about it? I think that's a difficulty. I don't know what the answer is. People are struggling.
Yeah,
At the extremes, you can deal with it. But short of the extremes, it's more difficult.
I mean, do you think this is a problem that Parliament, and the Lords especially, if a lot of them don't even use email, are capable of dealing with?
Just a few.
Okay.
Come on.
Round this down.
No. Look, if I send an email around to about 20 people, one or two of them, they have to have a hard coffee. But look, that's not... The argument in favour of an elected Lords does not depend upon their inability to use emails. I mean, come on, let's get it in proportion. We all battling with electronic stuff. Sorry, you were saying?
Do you think it's a problem that we need to consult people in the younger generation who've obviously been technologically literate a lot longer than many people in Parliament? How do you think we need to take a new approach to? Well,
I think, and you're all too old to be the experts on the electronic stuff. Sorry, you have to go younger. Yes, I do think so. I think older people can learn a lot from the way in which, you know, I've sent stuff out. And it gets quite a lot. I had a Syrian refugee boy who worked for me in Parliament for a bit, and I think the hits got up to about 2 million. But that's because other people who were following me were retweeting the thing. But, you know, they get about, and you get positive things. You can use them positively. But I do think one needs to use the experience and knowledge and nous of younger people. I agree with that, yes. Because, you know, I'm the far the wrong generation for this, you know. I may be able to do it, but I'm not so good at it.
Well, I'm glad to see some of us hopefully have a job waiting for us after in, you know, digital policy. So I have a few more questions if no one wants to ask any, but I thought I'd open up to the floor if anybody has a question they would like to ask. At the back there in the yellow.
Hi, Lord Dubs. I just had a question about the Labour Party again. Only a couple of days ago, they were forced into basically backing down over accepting the government's immigration bill by public opinion. You say that Jeremy Corbyn in private is very pro-refugee, pro-activist, and as an activist, I would totally agree. Do you think it's a fault of the Labour government over the last, beyond Corbyn, over the last 20 years, to accept the negative narrative on refugees rather than propelling a positive one into public?
Well, I mean, I think Jeremy Corbyn certainly has never accepted a negative anything about refugees. I don't think the Labour government was that bad, but it could have been a lot better. And I think the present government has ratcheted up their hostility. And I think once you look, I love it when we have slogans saying refugees welcome here. You know, it's saying something very positive. But when people say we've got too many here, then that is negative about every individual who's come here from elsewhere. It's a negative thing. And it makes people feel insecure, and it makes other people feel, well, you know, we don't want them here. So I think all governments have failed to do well. And I think that immigration bill is very narrowly, it's in very narrow terms, and we're trying to find ways in which we can broaden it a bit in order to put in some of the other amendments we'd like to put in. But it sent the wrong message. It sent a message. The Labour Party wasn't resolute about this, because we're talking about protecting the rights of people from other EU countries and so on after we leave the EU. I keep saying if, but anyway, after we leave the EU. And I think it came out badly. It came out as if the Labour Party wasn't sufficiently determined, and that was a pity. More than a pity, it was a tragedy. I'm not sure that quite answers your question, but
that's also partly due to the party's need to keep on side traditional kind of working class community voters who aren't so tend to be traditionally more Brexit voting or along those lines? Well,
I've heard that argument used most in the context of Brexit, where people have said, the Labour MPs have said to me, you know, we don't want a second referendum, you know, our people won't stand for it, because that's not the feeling of my constituency, they don't want that. And if I take a stand, the MP says if he takes a stand in favour of a second referendum, he will be hit badly. I think there's an element of that, although if you take a survey of Labour Party members, they're much more in support of a second referendum, much more in support of the EU than the voters in Labour constituencies, so there's a bit of a duality there. Well, I think at some point in politics, you can't run behind public opinion. I think you've got to run ahead of it. You know, I just think if it's something you really believe in, then I think you should say so. Because if you don't, then the people against it will certainly have a voice. So I think we've been not positive enough in the Labour Party. On the other hand, I'm quite convinced. Look, I've occasionally got a speech at Labour Party conference. Usually I get 3 minutes. The last Labour Party conference, they had me down. I spoke for 15 minutes on the same stuff as I'm talking to you, and I had the whole Labour Party conference there. You know, and I said, I turned to Jeremy and I said, look, I don't know if I can make policy on the hoof as a guest speaker, but I'm going to. This is what the Labour Party should do about taking 10,000 and so on. And I got a round of applause. Whether it becomes policy, I don't know. But look, you're right. There's a fear of opposition, you know, and there's a vocal minority who are very much in favour of refugees, and other people in the middle. And I think there is a fear of vocal opposition. I think there's been an element of that. I just think politics is about leadership, you know. And so I honestly, on the EU, we've been the only EU country that's had nothing about the positive things of the EU ever in it. Other EU countries, from Ireland to Hungary, you see all this stuff about the EU. Nobody's ever said it. If you don't support something, then you leave a vacuum politically for people who oppose it.
Fantastic, thank you. At the front in the pink.
Hi. What do you think about the argument for having open borders worldwide?
Open borders?
Worldwide.
For all people?
Yeah.
Well, look, in an ideal world, yes, but I don't think it's going to work like that while there are such big disparities. I think the problem with the freedom of movement in the EU, for example, that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about more than that. Freedom of movement is the disparities of income. Of course, there's a movement in one particular direction. But having said that, in an ideal world, freedom of movement would be a good thing. Okay? I don't think we're there yet, but I think therefore we should in the meantime be much more generous to people on the move, particularly those who have a good reason for moving. It's not a very good answer, but you know, you see what happens on the Mexican border, and it isn't just Trump as well. Some of the Democrats also. You know, works. Are you American? Yes. Sorry about that. So I'm not sorry about that. But look, it'd be a nice thing. But I think till we get to this ideal world, if ever, I would like to feel we're much more humanitarian in our attitude to people on the move. We're much more humanitarian to the other, that we welcome them, and we see people coming as a benefit to our society, not as something negative.
Thanks.
Fantastic. At the back there?
Thank you, Lord Dubs, and thank you for all your hard work. I just wanted to say something. You mentioned it briefly about Refugees Welcome and working with local council to find homes for refugees. And I think that's something that we as citizens and local communities can really be working quite hard to support our councils in doing and finding housing for both refugee children and refugees themselves who the government have signed up to welcoming 20,000 by 2020, and they can definitely do with our support in finding housing for getting some of those refugees into our country. So yeah, that's great. I also had a question about, you mentioned the Home Secretary's response to the recent channel crossings. I just wondered how you feel yourself and Parliament could do more to challenge the rhetoric that is used around migration, in particular asylum seekers, to do with genuine versus bogus asylum seekers, that I find very frustrating and really weighs down the debate. And I wish, like yourself are doing, that we could make it more of a moral argument. And I wonder your thoughts on that and how we could change it to more of a moral one rather than a legality, genuine versus bogus.
Yes. Well, I hate the expression. I know you're quoting other people saying bogus refugees, because I don't think any human being should ever be called bogus. It undermines them from the beginning. First of all, on the 20,000 scheme, there is a vulnerable person scheme. Have I got time to just go into a little?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now this is, yeah. Okay, so the 20,000 vulnerable person scheme, that's over 5 years. That's from Syria, Jordan, Turkey. And that's stopping in 2020. And one of our arguments has been, that's for families, has been that should continue. That should continue in some way. It is really important. There are people stuck in camps there, in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and we can at least do far more for them. But here's a little thing I didn't mention earlier. I told you that Theresa May summoned me in and said she wanted me to drop the amendment. Let me just tell you a bit more. You won't see this in books on the British Constitution. So Theresa May said, and I had a 3,000 figure in my amendment at that point. I want you to drop the amendment. She offered me a bribe. She said, if you drop the amendment, we will increase the vulnerable person scheme by 3,000, the 20,000 scheme from the region, and there will be refugees, a lot of children among them. No? And I said, look, I can't, I think we can do both. And she said, no, it's one or the other. So I said, no, I'm going to push ahead with my amendment. But that's 3,000 stayed in the system. It's very odd. So it's now 20,000 plus 3,000. I didn't like to talk about it too much in case the Home Office realized what had happened, because I think she thought I would succumb and therefore that would stay in and my 3,000 would disappear. But that's not how it happened. So the 3,000 stayed in the system, which was a little victory I couldn't talk much about until recently. And you don't see this in books in the British Constitution, but the Home Secretary was trying to bribe me, and in the end, so we got a bit of good out of that. But yes, these are drops in the ocean. When you got, as I say, when you got a refugee camp in Jordan with 80,000 people in it, and you've got more refugees in Jordan, about 1 million, large 40% of the country or something. Well, not 40, but anyway, large percentage. So I just think it's a matter of our mindset. It's a matter of how the attitudes we take to people. It's a matter of arguing the case and not being afraid to argue the case, and to say, look, we owe it as a country. There are international conventions which say we should give safety to refugees. We've got a good tradition of doing that, and we've got to do it. But I have no easy answers as far as public opinion is concerned. All I can do is to talk about it, and particularly I like going to schools and tell them, because young people are particularly, you're pretty young too, but young people are very responsive at schools. They react positively to this. I think we just have to go on doing it. Tell you a nice little story, if I may. I was asked to go to speak at a school in Tower Hamlets, and it was a maintained school. But I think it was all boys, and I'm pretty sure it was all they were all Muslim, Bangladeshi, okay, and very well behaved. And their project for these two classes, about 150 of them, was Kindertransport and the Holocaust. And this was about 6 months, a year ago, in the middle of the argument about anti-Semitism, this Bangladeshi boy says to me, What do I say to somebody who denies the Holocaust ever happened? That's terrific. You know, for a Muslim boy saying it at school in East London, I think that's really good. It's a sign that schools can move forward and be very positive about it, and therein lies a lot of hope for the future. But it can't just be schools, but we've just got to do it. And I don't know. I rely upon friends of mine, and everybody else to say the same thing that we're talking about now. There's no easy. I haven't an easy answer. So well, look, can I say, both for 20,000 and indeed for children, there is a problem of money. And one of the criticisms I get is, how dare you encourage child refugees to come here? We haven't even got enough money for the children that are already here. To which I say, very politically, it is not the fault of refugees that there's an austerity program which is affecting adversely both children in local authority care or the ability of local authorities to house refugees under that scheme or indeed child refugees. It's not their fault, and we're a rich enough country to do both. And I don't think child refugees should be the victims of austerity policies, but we've got to say we've got to do more for all young people the local authorities are responsible for. And similarly on the housing side, we've argued with the government, they should make more money available. They're cutting local authority money, they're not increasing it. And I accept the fact it's a very difficult situation. I had some local authority from the local government association chatting to them, and they said, look, money is our biggest problem. We could do far more if it weren't that money is so tight. It's the problem of austerity, that bit of it. But I don't think we should say, therefore, we can't do anything, because we can. We can do a bit more than we can do quite a bit more than we're doing now, I believe.
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions here at the front?
Hi, so how do you think we can change the minds of voters who see refugees as a threat to maybe cultural community?
So I said again, how do we change the mindset of
voters who see refugees as a threat to cultural community?
Well, okay. Well, look, if people see the other as a threat, it's quite difficult. All I can say is that. Well, I use London as a quite good example, because London is about as multicultural a city, a racial city as you can find in anywhere in the world. And I say this: look, we're a world where people are coming. We're used to a lot of people coming here. We are multicultural, and it works. And it is not a threat. And you find a lot of refugees who come here after a bit, they actually accept not all, but quite a lot of the cultural norms. There are tensions about LGBT stuff, and there are tensions in that's a religious thing. But I think we have to say this works pretty well. This is not a threat. There's some flats in Greece for Syrian refugees. And the Greek education authority said the children should go to local school. And the parents complained, we're not having these Syrian refugees mixed up with my children. And the children went to school. And after a bit, one of the mothers said, look, this is working well, they're all friends. Can I help more? So part of it is a familiarization as well. It's easier to be critical if you're living in Workington, where there aren't any black faces, than it is in London, where there are. So it's partly the unfamiliarity. I don't think you get that argument so much in areas where the population is quite mixed. I don't think so. But again, education and so on. And of course, I like to feel there are certain key issues on which I don't think we can compromise. I think we have to be very tolerant of values and religion and so on, and people being with them, but there's some on which we don't compromise. One is opposition to racism, no Islamophobia, no anti-Semitism. We should oppose opposition to LGBT rights and so on. And these, I think, have to be given. Mind you, there wouldn't be in Northern Ireland, but that's another argument. But these we have to take as given. And I'm afraid there are certain values, just a few, like those, which are fundamental to what we believe in. And I'm afraid if people come to this country, That's it. But on many other things, freedom of all the other things from their culture and so on, they're welcome, and we'd like to encourage them and enhance it. But there's certain sticking points, and we've got to be clear what they are. We mustn't make them too many, otherwise we're falling into the trap of just being critical of everybody. And it's quite difficult. But there are certain, I think we could probably agree, well, some of them, the ones I've mentioned, I think you probably all agree on those, you know. And you know, acceptance of rights of disabled and so on. These are things, and gender rights and so on. I think these are important, and these are part of what we believe in. And I think people coming here should know that. You know, now they may not accept it. There's a school in Birmingham where a head teacher's having an argument where the parents don't want their kids being taught LGBT stuff. You know, and I think that's got to be something that we just got to argue for, because. I mean, if you believe, as I do, that some of those are fundamental, then but only the fundamental ones, not the others. Otherwise, it becomes so wide, and it becomes, you know, all about religion and so on. I mean, I'm a humanist, so I don't go any of this religious stuff. But I speak it. I go to synagogues and stuff, and I speak about refugees. I said to one rabbi, "What am I doing here?" In the synagogue, I'm a humanist. She said, "Don't worry, half the congregation don't believe in God either." So I said, "What are they doing here?" And she said, "Community. Community." So, you know, there are ways of dealing with these things, I think. You know, but the people have to have the right to religion. I'm a humanist, they've got the right to religion. But I don't think they've got the right to criticize gay rights, you know, LGBT stuff, or women, equality for women. That's my view. I hope you agree.
Fantastic. Any last questions? Right at the back.
Good evening, Lord Dubs. My grandmother was also a Czech Jew who was born the same year that you were, so I find your story, your life story, incredibly compelling. My question to you is a more personal one. Did you have the opportunity to return to your place of birth after the collapse of the communist regime? And if so, how did that feel?
Well, okay. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you. One of the things I've found is almost everywhere I go, there's somebody either who came on a Kindertransport, not so many now because of the age thing, but quite a lot of who children or grandchildren or nephews and so on. So there's quite a big diaspora of the Kindertransport people. Have I been back to Prague? Yes, I have. I even went under the communists. Just my wife and I went on a holiday. I also then went. I went to a conference a year after. In 1969, after the Soviets went in to put down the Prague Spring, and I had some very interesting experiences there. And I've been back several times since. You know, I met the Czech President Havel once. So when you know, I don't feel. I do. When I go back to Prague, I do feel a twinge. You know, and I was driving down the road, and I said, "Where's this? This looks familiar." It was the road I'd lived in Smichov, you know, Hrečková. And so I find it quite complicated, because if I'm there for a bit, look, my Czech's nearly gone. Give me 3 months in Prague, and I'll be fluent in Czech again. But I did ask somebody something in Prague once, the way somewhere, and the guy took me for a Czech. I couldn't understand his answer, but at least he didn't think I was a Brit. but you know, there is a pull. There is something about it. But you know, all our family, I think everybody we knew either ended up in the camps or fled the country. I think we knew anybody. When my mother went back to Prague after the war to see whether she could re-establish, she couldn't. There was nowhere to live, and there was nobody there. So it's quite sad. You know, they're all gone. But I do get, I repeat, it sounds a bit emotional. I get a twinge when I'm back in Prague. Yes, I do.
Fantastic. Any last questions? No, well, thank you so much for that. It was really, really interesting. Lord Dubs has kindly agreed to do a brief meet and greet in the Kennedy room, which if you go upstairs, if you're facing the balcony, so if you're facing in here, it's on your right. There will be stewards there to guide you, so if you had any further questions, you can ask then. That's about it. So can we just have a nice round of applause for Lord Dubs? Ready to move?
Well, can I say thank you for this? It's all part of my mission about public opinion, not because you need to be influenced, but because you can influence other people. But thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. Better quality questions than I had for many a long time. But then you'd expect that here, wouldn't you?
Thank you. That's okay.